Alumni, friends, welcome to this year's Barbara Dicker Oration. I would like to begin this evening's event by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we're meeting, the people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay our respects to elders past and present. It's my great privilege to begin by introducing Mr. Ian Dicker AM. Mr. Dicker established the Barbara Dicker Brain Sciences Foundation in honour of his late wife Barbara Dicker to contribute to the well-being of individuals and communities by supporting research in the areas of dementia, depression and sleep disorders. Ian.
Good evening. I'm glad to see my family here to share tonight. Barbara died 3.5 years ago, and right to the end, through all the difficulties she had, she remained positive, a great smile, great attitude, and I'm sure if she can see down, but even if she can't, I'm sure she would be happy with what Swinburne is doing in the brain research field. They're doing a wonderful job, and the Dicker family is just absolutely thrilled to support them in what they're doing. Somewhat, as I said last year, I'm probably known for Hawthorn, but Barbara was really and truly Hawthorn. Both her grandparents lived in Barton Street in Hawthorn, so as a child, that was where she was. She only had to walk up and down the street to her grandparents. At a very early age, she was taken by her father down to the Glenferrie Oval, and it was through Barbara that I became Hawthorn, but she was really Hawthorn. And the same with Swinburne. I think that Swinburne must be the biggest business, the biggest community in Hawthorn today. And so I'm sure Barbara and Swinburne were meant to be together. She walked the streets of Swinburne. So as I said at the start, I'm really pleased, I'm thrilled at what the university has been able to do, what Mike as the principal leader has been able to do, and it was the university's suggestion that there should be an oratory, and I'm just thrilled that this second one is taking place. I would particularly thank David for his flying out here. Pretty hard on international travel, but I really am looking forward to what you've got to say. But again, most important, I want to thank the university for what they're doing in helping other people.
Thank you, Ian. It's now my great pleasure to introduce to you the Vice-Chancellor of Swinburne University of Technology, Professor Linda Christensen.
Chancellor, Mr. Bill Scales, AO, Mr. Ian Dicker, AM, Professor Clark, distinguished guests, colleagues, alumni and friends, I would like to offer a very warm welcome to all of you tonight, and a special warm welcome to Ian Dicker and his family on this occasion where we are remembering and also recommitting to our work, our research, to address the challenges that we'll be talking about tonight. It's wonderful to see so many of you here tonight, and a great privilege to once again welcome the Ian Dicker family. It's through their generous support that the Barbara Dicker Brain Sciences Foundation has been established at Swinburne to honour the memory of Ian's late wife, Barbara. The foundation has helped support the Brain and Psychological Sciences Research Centre, one of Australia's major mental health research centres. In the developed world, the burden of mental health disorders is now overtaking the burden of physical health disorders. At some point during the course of our lives, approximately 50% of us will develop a mental health problem with a need for care. Many of us here tonight have already been touched in some way by mental health issues, whether through personal experience or through a family member, friend, neighbour, or work colleague. The Barbara Dicker Brain Sciences Foundation enables further research into this vital health area. The Foundation supports applied research in brain and psychological sciences with a view to helping diagnose, treat, and prevent depression and related mental health conditions, sleep disorders, and dementia. The ultimate goal is to find a cure, treatment, or prevention for these conditions. Mental health research is an important priority worthy of support, and we believe we are making significant contributions to the community in the mental health sector. Swinburne now houses Australia's most complete human brain imaging research centre, here in the Advanced Technology Centre, incorporating state-of-the-art equipment including a magnetic resonance imaging machine and Victoria's first magnetoencephalograph machine, or MEG, and these facilities are dedicated to research questions. This equipment is complemented by computing facilities for image analysis, clinical interview rooms, clinical trials, and e-therapy facilities, experimental psychopathology and cellular neuroscience laboratories, and a baby lab so that we can understand the early developmental needs and issues and problems that may occur in infants. Swinburne's mental health research expertise includes research programs to understand and treat depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, autism, dementia, obsessive-compulsive disorder, hoarding disorder, body image disorders, and psychological aspects of health problems. Our researchers seek answers to questions such as, what brain processes are involved in mental health problems? What genetic, psychological, and other factors make individuals vulnerable to mental health problems? What are the most effective treatments for mental health difficulties? And how can we intervene early to avoid the social and psychological disability associated with mental health problems? Our e-therapy group leads the world in the development and dissemination of online treatments for mental health disorders. Many of you will have already seen the new mental health online platform that we're showcasing in the foyer outside. We anticipate that this new platform will change the way that psychological treatments are offered through mental health services and the community. We're extremely proud of our world-class Brain and Psychological Sciences Research Centre here at Swinburne, and deeply honoured to have the Barbara Dicker Brain Science Foundation underpin our broader research efforts. The Barbara Dicker Oration tonight honours the memory of Barbara Dicker and the philanthropy of the Dicker family, whose generosity will help many others with our continuing mental health research. At the heart of our endeavours is a commitment to improve the lives of many people who are affected day by day by mental health disorders. So thank you for being part of this tonight.
And now I have the great privilege of introducing to you our Chancellor, Mr. Bill Scales, AO.
Can I add my welcome to Linda's for everybody that's here tonight? I do want to also acknowledge Ian and his family for their great philanthropic contribution to the university, and I want to make just a couple of comments about that. I think we should understand at a time when people are talking about philanthropy what an important contribution that the Dicker family are making. They ought to be amongst some of Australia's great philanthropists for a number of reasons, not only because of the contribution that they make, but because what we now have, I think, is something like about 20 different projects, 30 different projects that have emanated from that philanthropic contribution. Why is that important? It's important because what happens with one contribution from an individual who has a problem which they believe they want solved, it multiplies in terms of what we believe ought to be then examined and followed through in a range of other ways. What that then does is enable us to be able to leverage from that by putting in grants to other research institutions that will then enable us to extend our knowledge. So what we actually see here in this form of philanthropy is something that's actually quite important to us. It actually enables us to take a problem from an individual or a community and see it in terms of adding intellectual property to it, which is what we do. But not in any way which is, in a sense, like what we would understand universities to be, that is ivory towers. It's about what goes on out there in the street, what goes on in the community, and the way which we combine that in a way which adds to our society's stock of knowledge. And that's why the philanthropy like the Ian Dicker Foundation is so important to people like us. It's an extremely important process because those principles are critical to the way in which organisation, and particularly a university like Swinburne, operates and acts. So much for that. So thank you very much, Ian. It's just absolutely outstanding for all of those reasons. And I do want to now, because I have the privilege of being able to introduce our guest speaker for tonight, Professor David Clark. Professor Clark is a leading researcher, educator and practising clinician in the treatment of depression and anxiety disorders. He received his PhD from the Institute of Psychiatry, Maudsley Hospital, University of London in 1984, and completed postdoctoral training in cognitive therapy at Beck's Centre for Cognitive Therapy in Philadelphia in the United States. Professor Beck is the founder of cognitive therapy, the psychological treatment that has made the greatest impact over the past 3 decades in the treatment of diverse mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, and of course schizophrenia. Professor Clark has been a long-time collaborator of Professor Beck, as well as a researcher within his own Brain and Psychological Sciences Research Centre. Professor Clark is currently Professor of Psychology at the University of New Brunswick in Canada. His research has been published in numerous scientific journals and he's authored several books. His latest book, The Mood Repair Toolkit, Proven Strategies to Prevent the Blues from Turning into Depression, is scheduled for publication in April of next year. Professor Clark has conducted numerous training workshops on cognitive behavioural therapy for depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, and other anxiety disorders worldwide. He is a founding fellow of the Academy of Cognitive Therapy and received the Aaron T. Beck Award for significant and enduring contributions to cognitive therapy in 2008. I'm delighted now to hand over to Professor Clark, whom I warmly welcome to Australia and to Swinburne for the 2013 Barbara Dicker Oration. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this invitation to be here. It's truly an honor and a privilege. This is my first time in Melbourne. Not my first time in Australia, but my first time in Melbourne, and it's been a delight. I want to thank Swinburne University and the Ian Dicker, Mr. Ian Dicker, and the Barbara Dicker Brain Science Foundation for inviting me, and also the personal invitation of Dr. Mike Kyrgios. Mike and I go back a few years. I won't say how many, but a few. We worked together on several projects, international projects on OCD and hoarding, and Mike has gone on to do tremendous work in the area of anxiety disorders and OCD. I had an opportunity to see the facility here at Swinburne this afternoon, and I must say I'm envious. You have a truly state-of-the-art, cutting-edge brain science research facility. And what I particularly like about it is that it's a very nice integration of the clinician and the neuroscience side. You don't often see that. Sometimes you'll see a very strong neuroscience research facility, a bit weak on the clinical side and the application side, and this is one of the first places I've seen around the world where you have this unique combination. And already from some of the projects that you're doing here, I can see that it's going to be a very fruitful endeavor. In fact, as you will see in my talk towards the end, as I talk about future directions, several of the future directions that I see for dealing with depression and other psychological disorders, the work is being done here right now. So it's very exciting to see what is happening here. So let's get on and talk about depression. You'll see that my talk is kind of a little bit of a controversial talk, or title, I should say, A Cure for the Common Cold of Mental Illness. if you know much about mental illness, you realize we don't really talk about cures as such. It's a little bit, and so that's why I have a question mark at the end of the title. So there are several reasons why we might use the metaphor of a common cold for when we refer to depression. It's an oft-cited metaphor because, in fact, depression, we have very high prevalence rates. And I'll show you some data, Australian data and also global data on the prevalence of depressive disorders. Depression varies in severity. It's kind of like a common cold. You can have a kind of a nasty cold, or you can have a slight touch. And as I'll show you some data, that depression is very much like this as well. There are mild forms of depression, very severe and serious forms, and so on. So it has a varying severity, kind of like a common cold. There's a tendency to remit. That is, the common cold, you know, after a few days, you tend to get better. Depression also has what we call a spontaneous remission. And so the good news is when people are depressed, they often do get better. The average person does. But the bad news is it does tend to return. And so just like you can get a cold again, so in depression, it tends to return. And both are tough to treat. And so that's why in the mental health area, often we use the term the common cold of mental illness when we refer to depression. What I'm going to do is, my talk tonight is kind of a wide-ranging talk. And so I want to start out by giving you some prevalence data on depression. Some of you will know this very well. Others, it may be a little bit new. Then I want to present a little bit of a paradox. The talk is kind of focused around this kind of odd finding that we have when it comes to depression. We want to go through a little bit about the nature and features, risk and vulnerability, and then end up with treatment and our hopes of finding, quotes, a cure, which we'll look at the cover at the end of the talk. So let's start with prevalence and burden. Okay, so this is basically a study that was recently published of Australian data on the what we call 12-month prevalence of depression in Australia. And what I've done is to look at the rates of depression in Australia compared to the United States, New Zealand, and Canada. And what you see is that basically the rate comes in at around 4.7, 4.8% for the annual rate of depression. The United States is a little bit higher, quite a bit higher actually. New Zealand around also a bit high, and Canada as well. The interesting thing is Australia, United States, and New Zealand all use the same diagnostic procedure to arrive at their prevalence rates for depression. Canada used a slightly cheaper version, and so we're kind of known for this, and so our rates are not quite the same as what you get here, but you know, in a sense, Australia's not doing bad. And the developing countries or the developed countries, I should say, more or less have similar rates of depression. If you look at the lifetime prevalence rates in the United States, it's about 16 to 17% lifetime rate for major depression or clinical depression. New Zealand, 18%. Australia comes in at 11%, and Canada at 12%. So again, what this tells us is that depression is, depending upon the studies, is the second to the third most common mental illness that we have. And anxiety disorders being the first, and substance abuse kind of the second, and then depression comes in at the third. It's interesting, though, that the prevalence rates for clinical depression do vary quite a bit between countries. So, for example, if you look at the World Health Mental Health Survey, again, when they report 12-month prevalence rates, the country with the highest rate of depression is the United States, followed by Nigeria, which has a prevalence rate of 0.8%, which is substantially lower than the United States and European countries, Canada and Australia, and so on. So what can we say? Depression is very common. And if we use prospective studies, and if we extend the criteria of what we mean by depression, so if we look at milder states of depression, these rates can go up much higher to 20%, 25%, and so on. So we certainly have a very prevalent disorder. It's a serious condition, and these are some of the conclusions that have been reached over a large number of studies. Even when we treat depression, it's very common for people who have good recovery to still have some of the symptoms of the depression even after they recover. So it's common to have residual symptoms even in treated depression. The disorder and the residual symptoms can cause significant cognitive and social impairment. So we can measure this, that when you've had a depression, it does have an impact on your ability to work and socialize, and some of that carries on even after the depression remits or is treated successfully. This third point is very important, which is its very high prevalence, relapse rates. So when people get better, they recover from their depressions, that it often returns. And the studies, again, vary. You can see that these numbers vary quite a bit, from 35% to up to 85% of people who recover from depression will then have another episode. And if they have a second episode, more likely to have a third episode, and so on. This is one of the big problems with depression that researchers around the world are trying to solve, is how can we lower the relapse rates when it comes to depression? Very, very important issue for research on this disorder. Suicide, 20 to 30 times higher in depression. Depression is the disorder that is the single biggest contributor to suicide. And so again, as a clinician, when we treat people with depression, we're always keeping a close watch on suicide potential and risk and so on. Very significant. Another is there's even a significant increase in mortality. So there are numerous studies now that have shown that the medical conditions medical complications associated with depression are higher, and that there's even a higher mortality associated with depression, even taking account some of these other health issues. And there's a substantial economic burden. In one of the recent Australian studies, this was cited as the annual cost associated with depression, and this includes the direct costs of treating depression, but also the loss in productivity and the loss in kind of personal functioning and so on. So there's a substantial burden, not only of personal suffering, but to our economies as well when we look at depression. So I would say to you, it's an important mental health disorder or condition, high prevalence. The onset is early, often in adolescence, lifetime course, high recurrence rates, and high levels of personal burden, economic cost, and so on. So the other difficulty, though, with depression, and the other problem we're trying to tackle, the vast majority of people with depression go untreated. And these, what we have here are the untreated depressions according to the World Health Organization. And again, we have data in this study from Australia, Canada, and you can see that our countries are all pretty well the same. In the low 42, 43% of people with depression never receive treatment. Some countries you can see are substantially higher, as you would expect, and then other countries, France, Norway, doing much better in terms of meeting the untreated need. This is something that we're, health regulators and so on, governments are very concerned about, and trying through public education and public awareness and so on to try to help people who might be depressed to get the treatment that they need. So this is another very important problem that we're trying to deal with. But then let me get on to the paradox. So here's the interesting thing. And this figure probably doesn't make a lot of sense to you because it's more of a visual representation of a finding. So this is basically two studies that I've kind of combined, two Australian studies. And in the blue, what we see here is a prospective, or I should say a longitudinal study that was done on prevalence rates of depression. And what you see is that over a 10-year period, there is a significant increase in the rate of depression in the population, okay? And the red bar represents the significant increase in the use of antidepressant medication. And if you notice, over again, about an 8 or a 10-year period, there has been a substantial increase in use of antidepressants. And what is interesting, and the paradox about this, is that the use of antidepressants, the increase exceeds the increase in the rate of depression, as you can see. So you would think that if, in fact, we were kind of matching up here, what we should do is match this properly. You would say, well, you know, you're getting an increase in the incidence of depression, so you should get also an increase in the use of antidepressants. Well, it looks like people were actually using more antidepressants, and yet the rates of depression aren't declining. So we're treating people, at least with pharmacotherapy, and yet we don't seem to be making a big impact at the population level in terms of what's happening with depression. So it seems to be increased. Now, the studies vary in terms of where we see these increases. Some of the studies suggest that the big increases are happening with our youth to young adults, anywhere between 16 and 25 years. Other studies are indicating that it's mainly middle-aged females where we're seeing the rates of increase in depression, but not amongst males. So we're not seeing an increase in incidence in depression amongst males, but mainly amongst middle-aged females. That was an American study that actually showed that. So it's not clear whether the increase in depression is even across the population. It may be that some segments of the population we're seeing more of an increase than others. So I want to try tonight to address, why is this? Why might we be offering more treatment and yet not necessarily making a big impact, at least at the population level, in terms of the rates of depression? So let's start with what is depression. And this next slide, I'm going to call it, I've kind of named it official depression. So what do we mean by depression? And there is a diagnostic criteria, and we have basically two sets of diagnostic criteria. On the left, we have the American criteria, which is DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It was recently revised and released of May of this year, called DSM-5, and then we have the International Classification of Diseases, or ICD-10. The criteria are quite similar, but not completely identical. And so basically, to be considered to have clinical depression, treatable diagnosed depression, then you're to have 5 or more symptoms. And these are the symptoms of depression. The symptoms must last at least 2 weeks or more. And so kind of what we suggest, or what we ask people is, are you feeling down or depressed every day, all day long for at least 2 weeks? So it's not just kind of feeling bad one day and then you feel okay the next day. It's kind of feeling down, depressed, consistently day after day for at least 2 weeks. You must have either a depressed mood or loss of interest, and then 4 of these, or it could be even 3 of these remaining symptoms. They must add up to 5, and you must have depressed mood or loss of interest. Most people who have depression have both, depressed mood and loss of interest. And then they have a number of other symptoms. These symptoms must be clinically, lead to clinically significant distress or impairment. So when we talk about the studies and we talk about depression, the studies are based on actually identifying people who meet these criteria. And now if we think about depression, of course, there are many phases, many various types of depression. And on the left-hand column here, we have the different subtypes of depressive disorder according to DSM-5. The main depression, clinical depression, is called major depressive disorder. DSM-5, we have some new ones. This one here, called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, is quite controversial because it's a new disorder that will mainly be diagnosed in children. So these are kind of irritable, bad-tempered little kids. The main symptom here is kind of having temper tantrums, temper outbursts, and that sort of thing. And there's been a lot of discussion in the research literature about whether this really is a justifiable disorder and whether we should actually have it or not. One of the reasons for introducing this is that in the U.S., there has been a 5,000% increase in the number of kids diagnosed with bipolar disorder in the last 10 years. 5,000. These kids, some of them as young as 2 years of age, are being put on lithium. Okay? And if you look at what is happening, many of those kids are not showing mania, but they're showing irritability and anger. So the hope is that these kids will be diagnosed with this particular disorder and not bipolar. And so kind of hoping that that will rectify a problem. So it's kind of an interesting history. This is one of those cases where, you know, you get a new diagnosis introduced and everybody is kind of concerned about overdiagnosis and so on, but you have to understand why the diagnosis was introduced in the first place. You can see that the ICD-10 deals with depression a little bit different. What it does, it more or less emphasizes the severity, and so depressions are kind of categorized as mild, moderate, or severe, or recurrent, persistent, and so on. All I want you to see is that there are not just one type. There's not just one type of depression. There are many different types of depressions. Okay. There are important psychological features of depression that are not captured in these diagnostic criteria. When you're depressed, you don't only have those symptoms, let's say, but you can have a lot of these other features as well. And a lot of these aspects of depression are what psychologists and therapists work with when they treat people with depression. So again, this is a fair list. Not everybody who's depressed will experience all of these symptoms, but they will experience many of them. And all of these are not really captured by the diagnostic criteria. So depression is a complex state. You know, it really does affect thinking, behavior, feeling, relationships, work, and so on, as you can see from this. Now, so one of the problems I want to mention here to talk about is to say, well, why are we having some difficulty with depression? You know, treating it and why don't we get better results and that sort of thing? So one of the problems is, how should we think about depression, right? How should we think about it? And there are three critical features of depression. Severity. If you treat anyone with depression, you're always trying to say mild depression, moderate, severe. And what I mean by that, a mild depression might be having some off days. You notice your concentration is not as good. Maybe you're having some tearful episodes, not sleeping as well. But it's not bad. You're getting to work. You're looking after your kids. You're kind of functioning, but it takes a lot of effort. That might be mild. Up to severe depression where it's so bad you can't get out of bed. You're not eating, you're not sleeping, you're not getting out of bed, you're practically unresponsive. So severity is a very important feature of depression. How severe is depression? Whether the depression recurs or not, is this a first episode or are you having recurring episodes? That's another important feature. And the third one is, how much is it interfering in your quality of life, right? Now, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, mental health professionals kind of have two broad ways of thinking about depression. And I've called them the bubble theory, or perspective, versus the thermometer perspective. Now, those of you in the science will know this as categorical versus dimensional, right? What do we mean by categorical, and what I mean by the bubble theory is this. So, you see a bubble. Either you're in the bubble or you're outside the bubble. If you think of the bubble as being depression, this theory says either you're depressed or you're not depressed, right? And so if you're depressed, we will offer you treatment, give you medication, therapy. But if you're outside the bubble, you don't need therapy. You don't need any treatment or medication. Now, that's one way to think about depression. It's kind of the standard medical way to think about depression. The other way to think about it is kind of like a thermometer, where you kind of get increasing amounts of depression. So maybe down here, you have very few symptoms or no symptoms at all. And then as you rise, more and more symptoms, a little bit more severe, until maybe you get to a threshold. And at that point, then you start saying, well, this really is a depression that should be treated. Most of the research, certainly the medical research, has been based on the bubble theory. You're either depressed or you don't have depressed. So if you have 4 of the symptoms of depression, you're not depressed. Well, wait a minute now. You've got 4 symptoms. So that means you're not depressed, or you're kind of partially depressed, or a little bit depressed? What does that actually mean? But from the bubble theory point of view, it means you're not depressed. No treatment, no medication, no counseling, whatever, because you're not depressed. The thermometer theory says, well, maybe you're almost depressed, or maybe you're up here somewhere. Maybe you should be treated. Maybe you should be offered some service of some kind. So what does this data say? What does the research tell us about the nature of depression? Bubble or thermometer? So this is a little bit of data that we collected over the years. And so what we have here are basically 2 lines. So the red line, and this is what we call self-reported depression. So all of these folks were given what is known as the Beck Depression Inventory. 21 items, and it basically asks you various things about how depressed you are, how irritable you are, how you've been sleeping, this sort of thing. And you rate it on a scale and you get a score. The people in the red were 705 people with major depression. All of these people had been given a diagnostic interview. They're from Beck's Center for Cognitive Therapy in Philadelphia. And we know all of these people in the red had clinical depression. They all had clinical depression. These people in the blue are Canadian students. Now, unfortunately, there's 647 of them. We didn't actually do a diagnostic interview on 647 students because it's way too expensive and difficult. So some of these students probably were clinically depressed. Maybe I would say anywhere from 5%, maybe 5 to 7%, which would be out of this group, maybe 30 of them were clinically depressed, I would say, estimates. But notice when they rate their symptoms, we get a crossover here. First of all, we've got these people here who are clinically depressed who say they don't have any depressive symptoms. And we've got these students, of course, they say, they don't have, most of them say I don't have any depressive symptoms, too many. But then you've got this group right here who are reporting depressive symptoms. And you see the crossover here. I mean, what this tells us is this is what you would expect to see from a thermometer point of view, that you get increasing amounts of depression, and then some people who are non-depressed have a lot of depressive symptoms, and there are other people who are clinically depressed, have very few symptoms. So this kind of suggests that we should be thinking about depression more from the thermometer point of view and not the bubble point of view. So far, so good. So then I wondered, okay, the Beck Depression Inventory kind of assesses a range of depressive symptoms. What if we used a more specific measure of a symptom, let's say one symptom that we know is a really good symptom for distinguishing depression from non-depression? And one of the best predictors of depression and non-depression is how people think, whether they have thoughts of loss and failure. So in this next slide, Same sample. No, actually, it wasn't the same sample. Same sample of the clinical sample, a slightly different student sample. And we gave them something called the cognitions checklist. And the cognitions checklist is asked only about your thoughts, what you were thinking. And 14 of the items deal with thoughts of loss and failure. What we find here that's fascinating is that profile looks quite different. And what you find is the students, most of them, the vast majority, have very few of these negative thoughts. And if you look at the clinical group, a vast majority of them have a lot of these clinical thoughts. This profile looks more like the bubble theory, a little bit more. It's kind of discontinuous. So we're kind of back. Depending upon the symptoms, if you look at all the symptoms of depression, it looks like it forms more of that thermometer view. If you pick out the specific symptom of negative cognitions, then it's more of the bubble. The problem, though, is as practitioners, we never diagnose depression just on the basis of your thoughts. We always ask about these broader symptoms. What happens is it's very difficult for practitioners to know whether you have depression or not. That's my point I'm trying to make. It's very hard to know. How many of these symptoms should you have? I mean, how severe should it be before you start offering people treatment? Okay, so that's one problem, which is the nature of depression. And at a fundamental level, sometimes we really even have a hard time knowing who's depressed and who isn't. The other thing, then, we need to look at is not everybody is susceptible to depression. We have risk and vulnerability factors. So here's some of the risk factors, and many of you will know this very well. Women, depression is twice as common in women as it is in men. Teens and young adults seem to be at a higher risk. We seem to be getting that increase amongst the youth. Income seems to be related particularly to depressive symptoms. So, if you're from a disadvantaged group or depressed income, you're more likely to have depressive symptoms. Marital status, depression is higher in divorced and widowed. I often cite this to my undergraduate students, and they have a difficulty with this. Some of the early research suggested that married women had higher rates of depression, and single men had lower rates. It was like this. It was married women had higher rates of depression, and single women had lower rates of depression. And so some of the students were struggling with that because they said, well, and so I ended up by saying, you know what? Marriage is good for men, bad for women. And so they would argue with me. They'd say, well, how can that be? If it's good for one, it's going to be good for the other, and so on. But trying to say that for married women, marriage is a risk factor for depression. It's kind of interesting. Also, a family history. So if you have a family history of depression, you're at higher risk for depression. But risk doesn't tell us what causes depression. What risk tells us is who is more likely to become depressed. What we're really interested in is what's causing it. And that you have to look at vulnerability factors. One of the vulnerability factors that we know of are negative life events. Negative life events are very important when it comes to depression. So the first statement here, and we've had like decades of research on this now, severe major life events cause depression onset, especially what we call loss or exit events. So these are things like deaths, unemployment, loss of income, illness, because illness is a loss of health, and so on. These kinds of events involving a loss are associated with high rates of depression. Depression is more severe when associated with life events. Many years ago, we used to say, okay, if you were depressed because of a severe life event, then your depression wasn't as bad. We called it reactive depression. In fact, that was completely the opposite. What we discovered in later research is when you have a severe life event, like the death of a loved one or unemployment or something to that effect, that your depression can be even more severe. Daily stress and disadvantaged income status predicts depression. What that means is that if you have a disadvantaged income, lower income status, that you're more likely to become depressed. There is some mixed evidence. Some studies suggest that minor life events, I don't know, getting parking tickets and just having a really bad day over and over again can lead to some depression. But the studies are a bit more mixed on that one. Having life stressors while in treatment. So if you're in treatment for depression, and let's say you lose your job, then that will reduce treatment effectiveness. And life events after recovery increase the risk of relapse. In other words, life events are absolutely important when it comes to treating depression. You've got to find out what's happening in their life and some of the unfortunate circumstances they face. Here's some data that we have from a study that we just kind of completed. This is a university student study, and all of these people, mainly, I guess it was both men and women, they'd had a breakup, a romantic breakup in the last 3 months. And I'm not going to ask for a show of hands in terms of how many have ever experienced a romantic breakup, but I suspect that most of you, if you go back to your youth, you can think of having a boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, maybe a somewhat serious relationship, and there was a breakup. And you know what that was like, or maybe you don't remember. If you're like me, it's hard to remember. It's been a long time, but you know, it's stressful. It's very distressing. And in fact, what we find is that we had 2 groups. So we had these groups of people who went through this romantic breakup, and we were able to identify 2 groups. One who were very distressed over the breakup, a high breakup distress group and a low breakup distress group. In other words, they either initiated the breakup or they were okay with it, or it was mutual consent or whatever. But notice this, the Beck Depression Inventory is a depression measure. If you look at the high distress group, high rates of depressive symptoms, in fact, their scores were similar to what we get in major depression. What was it? What did they have in common? They had a breakup of a boyfriend, girlfriend, a romantic relationship. Some of these other data, I don't have time to go into them, but just to say that these people with the high breakup distress were having more intrusive thoughts about the romantic partner, about the breakup. They were having more doubts about the relationship, more blaming themselves. And, you know, we're now wanting to follow these people up and to see whether, in fact, the way you handle, and this is what I'm very interested in following, is the way you handle a breakup when you're a young person, does that have any predictive value about your susceptibility to depression later in life as you go through? I suspect it might. Because what we know is interpersonal loss and conflict is a strong predictor of depression. So these data just to show that life events are very important when it comes to depression. But it's not the whole story. It's not the whole story because we know lots of people have bad things happen to them and they don't become depressed, right? I mean, it's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. So we have to look at other vulnerability factors, and I want to suggest 2 sets. One are biological variables and psychological variables. Now, this is where after the tour of the facility here, I'm very embarrassed to put up the biological stuff because you are so far ahead of me on this, but I'm just going to go through it very quickly, not to embarrass myself too much. So this is a slide on the genetics, and there's been, over the last 10, maybe 15 years, there's been a lot of play in the media and also in the science journals and so on, what we call the depressive gene. And what this is there is a gene that regulates called the serotonin transporter gene, and I'm not going to get into all of the technicalities of this, but it's a gene that seems to regulate the protein responsible for the transmission of serotonin, basically the synapses. Serotonin is very important because it's a neurochemical that seems to be implicated in depression. And a lot of the antidepressants, the new antidepressants and so on, affect the regulation of serotonin. So the way we treat depression is the regulation of serotonin, and here we have a gene that seems to be involved in serotonin. And what we find is that if you have a short allele on this particular gene, the early research suggested that you had a vulnerability to depression. Now, the studies just looking at whether you had that short allele on the serotonin transporter gene leading to depression, the studies were mixed. And then a study was published in Science in 2003, I believe it was, by Caspi, which is a New Zealand study. And what they did, which was absolutely revolutionary, is they did they looked at the genetic makeup of their sample and identified three groups of people, three groups of youths. These were all people in their early 20s, New Zealanders, and they've been followed these people since they were kids. And they, so Caspi and colleagues, they had three groups. They had one group that had 2 copies of the short allele, a second group that had 1 short and 1 long allele, and a third group that had a long allele. And then they looked at, which nobody else had done before, they looked at life events, whether the person had a stressful life event. And this is what they found. This is their data. They found that, and they followed these people over, I think it was a 3-year or 5-year period. You see here, these are the vulnerable people. These are the people with the short allele, the intermediate, and these are the healthy, genetically healthy, we'll say, individuals. And this is self-reported depressive symptoms. As you get an increase in the number of stressful life events, the people with the short allele gene, the, quotes, depressive gene, actually had more depressive symptoms. They actually had a higher probability of diagnosable depression, and they also had a higher probability, look at the suicide ideation attempts, massively higher suicide attempts if you have both the genetic vulnerability and the stressful life events. This was considered breakthrough. This was considered, a breakthrough in depression research. What has happened in the meantime is that a flurry of studies have come out since, looking at the serotonin transporter gene. It seems like the Caspi data has been replicated in some studies, has not been replicated in many studies. The latest findings seem to suggest that it may not be life events that's important, but it may be personality. So gene times personality interaction leading to depression. Whoops. The other thing that's kind of interesting here is that some of the more recent studies in the last couple of years, and this is the kind of research that can be done in this facility. I can't do this kind of research, but you can do this kind of research here, which is to look at the effects of gene and information processing, how people actually process information. And it looks like it's not only, it's just the gene, the environment, but also how you process information that's important. The other piece to this, and this is the brain science piece, is looking at, and actually when I did this tour, there's some of this work that is currently going on here at Swinburne, looking at depression and parts of the brain that are affected by depression. And it looks like a lot of studies are finding that this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, you have less activation in this part of the brain in people when they're depressed. And this is the part of the brain that deals with planning and reasoning and the control of emotion. There's another part of the brain that depression researchers are very interested in, is anterior cingulate cortex, again, involved in emotion. And the third one is the amygdala, that is involved in the identification and the generation of emotion. So there's research, a lot of research now, neuroimaging research, that has identified these areas of the brain that seem to be important in depression. What we don't know, though, is this important in the condition of depression, or is this what happens when we feel sad or feel in a depressed mood state? And so that's kind of we're hoping where the research will take us from then on. The other piece to the vulnerability, which I want to mention, is what we call cognitive vulnerability. And this is how people process information. If you want to think about it, what you're doing right now, those of you who are still awake, that is, you're processing information. Those of you who are not awake, you're not quite processing much information at the moment. But as you're sitting there, maybe you're listening, maybe you're thinking about this, and you're kind of taking it in, hopefully, and it's making some sense to you, you're processing it. When people are depressed, they think differently. And you can think of the iceberg here, where at the top, they have these conscious thoughts that are quite negative thoughts about themselves, the world, and the future. And right under here, they're kind of, remembering, if they remember things from the past, the memories, they're kind of negative memories. They evaluate themselves, make judgments in a very negative way. And they have beliefs about themselves and the world way down in here that, again, is very negative. What we think is this is very much driving the depression. Let's get to treatment. So we've got research, then, that suggests the nature of depression is probably more of the thermometer type. We've got studies that suggest genes are important. Not quite sure whether this serotonin transporter gene is really the best gene marker for depression, but research, strides are being made. We know that there are brain systems that are pathways that are implicated in depression, neuroimaging stuff. And we know life events are very important, and we know information processing, how you process information. All of these factors go into the nature of depression. So how do we treat it? And we've got basically these two approaches, kind of roughly speaking. We've got medication, and we've got cognitive therapy or cognitive behavior therapy. And that's Beck, not a great picture of him with the Dalai Lama. So there you go. And the book there, this one, is his foundation. That's kind of the original treatment manual for cognitive behavior therapy. Okay. One slide on antidepressants, because I'm not a physician. So this is kind of what we know about antidepressants. It looks like all the different kinds of antidepressants that we have, they're all about roughly equal in terms of effectiveness. It's not that there's one medication that's the most effective when it comes to treating depression. The efficacy rate is approximately 65% at best. At best. But that 65% only represents 19% greater than a placebo. That is, if you give people a sugar pill, half of them will get better. Approximately half of them will get better. A little under that, 45%, something like that. And then if you give them the active drug, 65% maybe get better. Something like that. It looks like antidepressants, ironically, are not very effective for mild depression. Not very effective. You say, why? That doesn't make sense. Mild depression should be easy to treat. No, mild depression is very hard to treat. The reason is that placebo is very effective with mild depression. So the drug can't beat out the placebo. About 30 to 40% of depressed individuals are non-responders. In other words, they take a variety of medications, they don't respond very well. And when they are given CBT, they don't respond. That's a fairly high rate. We're concerned about that. That's why we can't be kind of comfortable in what we've achieved so far when it comes to depression, because we want to certainly be able to treat these people who are what we call non-responders. About 50 to 75% will relapse after discontinuing medication. So if you were to treat people with medication, let's say after 8 weeks or so, usually 8 to 12 weeks, if you abruptly stop their medication, 50 to 75% will relapse within months, up to a year. It's very fast. There is evidence that if you continue on your medication after recovery for another 4 to 9 months, you can reduce that relapse rate by 2/3. It's not clear that if you keep people on medication for years, that you will reduce relapse. And unfortunately, what happens in the real world is people are often kept on for years. There's no real evidence that that's necessarily helping in terms of the long term. And here's an interesting study that I just came across, is that 72% of patients stop their antidepressants by 6 months. In other words, the vast majority of people, when they're given medications, will stop on their own. They don't like the side effects, they don't keep it up, and so on. So the story here is that the effectiveness of the antidepressants are approximately 45–50%, all in all. Now, cognitive behavior therapy is the structured therapy, and what we aim is a kind of a problem-solving therapy, collaborative, and what we're trying to do is change the way people think. Change the way people think, you can change the way they feel. If you address the negative thoughts and address the negative beliefs, help them to process information in a more balanced way, you can get improvements in their depressive symptoms. There's the basic elements. Again, I realize we're kind of running out of time, so I won't go into too much on the basic elements of cognitive therapy. It's fairly complex. It's very different components to it. One of the important parts of cognitive therapy is to give people actual homework assignments to do, to actually try some things out in real life and help themselves feel better. And that's the basic structure of a cognitive therapy session. If you were to see a therapist, you kind of review what happened in the past, you set an agenda, you work on some agenda items, and so on. I want to show you now a link, a little kind of YouTube animation. It's only about 3 or 4 minutes. It's a little bit silly, but it just gives you kind of a hint of the idea of how cognitive therapy works.
Janet works as an engineer. She goes to work on Monday. Her boss, John, had a big fight with his wife the night before. Therefore, John is in a really bad mood and does not want to talk to anyone. Janet says hi to John. John shakes his head, goes to his office, and closes the door. Janet starts her negative thinking. Oh my God, my boss is mad at me. He must be mad at me because of the mistake I made on that project last week. Maybe we're having layoffs. I might even get fired. What am I going to do if I lose my job? I know I am going to get fired. I am not a good programmer. I am so stupid. I always mess everything up. Who is going to pay my mortgage? Who is going to pay for all the medications I take? My boss is such a jerk. I really don't like this guy. As a result, Janet gets very anxious. She can't even concentrate on her work. She sends her boss an email and tells him that she is not feeling well, and she goes home. Let's look at Janet now, after she learns cognitive behavioral therapy. Janet's therapist starts doing cognitive behavioral therapy with her. Now she knows that her anxiety is caused by assuming or mind reading. During the therapy, she learns to catch herself every time she is assuming or mind reading. Let's see how Janet deals with the same issue now. Janet says hi to John. John shakes his head, goes to his office, and closes the door. Janet feels anxious. However, having gone through cognitive behavioral therapy, she recognizes that she is assuming something that might not be true. Janet starts getting nervous, but she decides to investigate if he is really mad at her. Janet goes and has a talk with her coworker, who works in the next cubicle. She tells her coworker about their boss. Her coworker tells her that their boss seems to be in a bad mood today. Once she realizes that her boss's mood has nothing to do with her, she goes back to work and finishes her work. What you just saw is the basis of how cognitive behavioral therapy works. Janet was able to change the way she reacted to the same situation by recognizing her faulty thinking. Once she recognized her faulty thinking, she was able to change her emotion and her behavior.
Teaching people to handle life problems, even simple ones like, your boss being angry at you, and how can you think your way through that? How should you think about that problem in a way that's healthier rather than just leaving work and so on and making your problem worse? How could you solve that problem in a much better way? And of course, she has to change the way she thinks in order to do that. So that's kind of the sense of what we try to do in cognitive therapy, cognitive behavior therapy. Now, how effective is this treatment? Well, CBT is kind of equal to medication at the acute phase. It's effective, and this is what we now know. You might think, well, this kind of therapy could see working with mild depression, but really severe depression, I don't think it could work. Well, that's not true. The studies suggest that cognitive therapy can be very effective with severe depression. Cognitive therapy seems to be associated with a lower relapse rate than medication. And that finding has been pretty solid over the years. What we say in the business is you're teaching skills, not pills, right? So you're trying to teach people how to handle some of the problems in their life, and that seems to hopefully, and it does seem to reduce relapse rates. There is an advantage to adding CBT to medication versus medication alone. It's more effective, and there's preliminary evidence that CBT may be effective for mild or what we call subclinical depression. So some good news there, I would say. But we have a long ways to go. And so there are new innovations and new treatments coming along all the time. They're kind of based on cognitive behavior therapy, but there are some, as I say, new innovations. One of them is mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which focuses more on helping people to learn how to disengage from their thoughts. There's something called acceptance and commitment therapy that looks at the values that people have. Compassion-focused therapy, which is kind of an interesting approach, which says if you actually help people to be more kind and compassionate to themselves and to other people, that has positive impacts on mood. Something called bias, cognitive bias modification. Watchful waiting is an interesting one, which is maybe what some people need is rather than an antidepressant right away or intense therapy right away, that what it might be is just kind of supportive therapy and helping them kind of get through a difficult time. Watchful waiting. And this is some of the work that you're doing here at Swinburne University on low-intensity CBT and internet-based CBT, which is having great promise in terms of helping a lot of people. We also got, and that's the basis of the book, is what we call a mood repair approach, which instead of having people come for treatment for a specific course of treatment over several weeks, is to say, okay, how can we teach people skills to change their mood on a day-to-day basis? And so looking at it more as a mood management strategy rather than as a treatment strategy. There are some great new systems, great new changes that have been made. England, we have something called improved access to psychological treatments, and they've invested millions and millions of pounds in terms of training CBT therapists and offering it to large numbers of the English population through the healthcare system. Again, I won't go into a lot of details because we're running out of time, but some of the studies coming out, and these are based on thousands and thousands of people. The interesting thing is we're coming in, or they're coming in at about 42, 43% effectiveness. Clinically improved means that they came in depressed. After treatment, they basically are no longer diagnosable depressed. But you also see we have these over 45% who are unimproved. But here's the thing that's the good news. These people are improving with only 5 sessions of therapy, an average of 3 contact hours. Most of these people are getting low-intensity CBT or internet-based CBT, and yet they're still improving. So some of these interventions, even though there are minimal contact, and they're not that terribly expensive, you can still get pretty significant effects. So I would say that finding a cure, we're targeting the problem of relapse, treatment non-adherence. the non-responders, specialized group. All of these are some of the specific problems that current researchers are targeting for depression. So I would conclude by saying, well, do we have a cure? We don't have a cure, obviously not. We've made a lot of progress. We know a lot more about depression today because of some of the basic, the neuroscience, the psychological research that is occurring. We have new treatments. We have treatments that work, but we've got a long ways to go because we don't really know what works, for whom, or why. And that's the question for the future that we're trying to address. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Clark. We do have time for a few questions. There are roving mics in the room, so if I could ask you to wait until the microphone comes to you before you actually ask your question.
Hi, I'm Gabrielle. One of your earlier slides had a bar graph regarding people who non-reported depressive rates. How do you gather that data if they're not reporting?
Oh, you mean the untreated?
Untreated.
Yeah, was that what you were referring
yes.
to? Yeah. So okay, there are several ways that they do that. Sometimes, for example, it's through these national probability studies. So these are individuals who, they're not treatment seeking. So they're population-based studies. And so what you do is the interview goes in, asks a lot of questions, discover that the person, maybe through answering the questions, that they do actually have a depression, and then they ask, obviously, whether they've ever gone for treatment and that sort of thing, so they can kind of pair that up. And then ask in the Canadian study, because I've actually, I'm working with the Canadian data right now from Statistics Canada, and the way the question is worded is things like, do you have a mental health condition that you believe has not been met? And that's another way of doing it. So you can actually look at people who have diagnosable depression, but they've never been treated, and then you get these statistics. You can also ask people whether they have an unmet need, and base it on that as well. So that's another way of doing it. So we have a couple of ways.
My name's Dee Backman-Hoyle, and I'm co-chair of the National Mental Health Consumer and Carer Forum. So I come from the point of the lived experience, and sitting with me are some colleagues of the lived experience, all alumni here, and all very intelligent people in the mental health space. I guess what I'd like to understand is what level of research has gone into the advantage and further development of efficacy in the utilisation of people with the lived experience in developing solutions or looking for best practice. Because I guess we've been sort of struggling for 30 plus years that we've been seen now, and we've gone past nothing about us without us, but we still feel very much in the bubble, people looking at us inside the bubble when we're screaming, you've got to see the thermometer. And so, in a nutshell, how do we demonstrate improved efficacy and research in having a triad of clinicians, practitioners, professionals, lived experience, and I'm going to suggest family and friends in the equation?
I mean, that's I'm not sure if that's a question or a comment, but, I think it's a comment. I know that in Canada, some of the research councils are putting more and more emphasis on broad-based research teams that include, individuals, advocates, the community people with the lived experience with whatever that condition is. So if it's depression, people who have actually had depression, people who are on community boards, and mental health. We have like the Canadian Mental Health Association, and these kinds of organizations. So the actual research councils are putting more and more emphasis on that. They don't want to see just psychologists or just psychiatrists or whatever. They want to see a broad team of individuals, and they want to see that happen at the development phase, not just, after everything has been designed and decided and, you kind of bring people in and put them on your board or whatever. But to see that happening, right from the get-go, from the very beginning, as you are developing the research questions and how to go. So that's happening, but I agree with you, it's a slow process. And it's taken us a long time to get there. We should be moving in that direction much more quickly. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks. My name's Zoe Warren. I just wanted to ask for your thoughts on how health literacy actually impacts the treatment of the patient and their understanding of the CBT or the treatment that they're undergoing, and if you knew of any studies around that.
Health literacy. First of all, I can tell you from a personal experience, because I actually I do research, but I also have a practice as well. So I actually see people who are, dealing with these issues. And for me, from a personal and practitioner point of view, it's much better to have a well-educated, a well-informed client, let's say, who has, done their research or their reading on the treatment and the condition and so on. It goes so much better. It's so much better. In terms of the actual research, it's not clear what role health literacy plays in terms of determining the effectiveness of treatment. These are in these clinical trial studies. I saw at least one study recently as of preparing this that got kind of a counterintuitive result, which suggested that people who had higher literacy didn't do as well as people with lower literacy. Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I don't know how to interpret that finding, but that was just one study. So I would say that in terms of mental health literacy, absolutely, I'm all for it. I think it's important. We need to get it out. We've got those people with the unmet need, and we think that part of the reason it's an unmet need, maybe they don't really know. The other part of that that's important to address, and I know in Canada, and I think in Australia you're addressing this too, the problem of stigma. It's a huge problem. And so if we can address stigma, maybe people will come forward more. I do a lot of work with the Canadian military, and stigma is a huge problem in the military. And so, again, trying to break down those barriers and change it. And as you do that, people are coming forward and asking for help. I think it plays a very important role. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this lecture. Some of us in the business faculty approach this in a different way. We look at people in the workplace. 1 in 5 have a mental illness. I've come up with policies on how to look at this, and we're hoping to trial them next year. And I was very interested in the comments made there, because the Australian Bureau of Statistics did a very interesting survey in 2007 using the diagnostic surveys, and they found that 20% of Australian employees have a mental illness. Yeah. That's a staggering amount, and most of them keep it hidden. The stigma is very high. And I'm very encouraged by your talk tonight, because I actually think I should reach out to my colleagues in science and see if we can have some joint research here, because they're doing the beginning and we're looking at them in the workplace suffering. Yes. So I'm very, very encouraged by that. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was just wondering if you had any comment on, or any thoughts on building resilience in children and the idea of attacking the problem earlier in life. Is that a good thing? Do you know of any research that might be supporting the use of resilience and coping strategies building in kids?
I mean, first of all, it makes an awful lot of sense, doesn't it? Because if you look at the age of onset for depression, let's say, it's in adolescence and young adult. And often, even when you do your initial, sometimes you will see that initial episode of depression, let's say at 18 or 19. But then when you do an in-depth life history, you find that it's middle school, what we call middle school, which is about 12, 13. Often you start to see it at that point. So it makes a lot of sense. Could we intervene at that early age? Yeah, and build some skills in there and reduce the rates of onset of depression. It makes a lot of sense. It's very difficult to demonstrate scientifically the effectiveness of prevention studies, because you need to follow people for many, many years, right? And because the ultimate test is, can you reduce the rates of onset? So how long do you follow these kids? 10 years, 20 years, 30 years to find out how many of them develop a depression? So we're just beginning to look at some of that. But we have to move ahead and actually do it, of course, first, and then make sure we measure the outcomes. So I think it's most encouraging. I think it's definitely a very important area for research. How effective it is, I think we have to wait and see. Yeah.
Professor Clark, thank you very much. I'm going to ask you to do one thing before we formally thank you for the evening. We do have a door prize this evening. What we will do is make a donation of $100 to Beyond Blue in the name of the person who you draw out of our bowl here, and we'll also have a small gift and a certificate available out the front later on.
Okay. Never done this before.
It's one of our colleagues from RMIT University, Jim McGovern. Congratulations, Jim. So, a donation on your behalf to Beyond Blue, and there is a certificate available out at the counter out the front. Professor Clark, thank you so much for your talk tonight. You said during your talk that depression is a complex state. There's no question about that based on what you've told us, but I think all of us are more enlightened than we were before we arrived this evening about the nature of depression, and I think a number of us, if not all of us, are heartened and encouraged at the work that you and your colleagues are doing on all of our behalf in this important area. So on behalf of all of us here this evening, thank you very much. And to our alumni, our friends, our staff and our students who've joined us here this evening, thank you for your attendance. We look forward to seeing you when we have the 2014 Barbara Dicker Oration. Thank you again.